This is the one all the boys want right here. And you see that beautiful color. She's a beauty queen. Well, hello everybody, Ant-Man here. Gonna do something a little bit different here in this video. Generally, I just recount my adventures out there in the Everglades and kind of do a vlog of the captures I make with these pythons. But in this episode of Ant-Man's Adventures, we're gonna actually go over techniques on how you can win or at least participate in the Florida Python Challenge. So the Florida Python Challenge is an annual event that the state puts on for people to get out there in the Everglades, and it encourages them to experience the Everglades and remove some pythons in the process and have a good time. The Python Challenge has been going on for quite a few years now. It generally used to occur during the winter months, which would be a totally separate set of techniques on how to find pythons. But for the last few years, the Python Challenge has occurred at night, generally in August, which coincides with the tail end of hatchling season for pythons. And that's what's going to make up the bulk of the captures. If you want to win the Python Challenge, you're going to want to focus on catching smaller pythons. That's going to make up the vast majority of what gets caught. I know everybody thinks that the 16-footers around every corner. It's just not the truth. You will find big snakes if you're out there enough, but it's just generally not that common of occurrence. There's usually over 1,000 participants in the Python Challenge, and every year maybe one snake is going to approach that size. So what you're going to want to focus on is the smaller snakes, and I'm going to give you the techniques that you're going to need to find those snakes, and the large snakes for that matter. There's pretty much 3 techniques that you can use during the Python Challenge during the winter months. You want to just totally forget about hunting during daylight hours. You're not going to find any snakes. It's too hot. The pythons in the daytime this time of year are going to be in the water or in refugia, totally out of sight. You're going to want to focus on hunting at night. And that's going to mean that you have 3 ways that you could do this. You can either do what's called road cruising, which is simply driving roads, both dirt roads and paved roads that are inside the Python Challenge program area. And you're also going to want to go on levees or on any of the areas that are in the challenge area on foot or on bicycle. And a lot of these areas are not accessible to the public with a vehicle, but they are accessible via walking or with a bike. Either way, we're going to go over the techniques that you can use to be successful. You're going to want to focus, like I said, on looking for snakes that are 24 to 28 inches long. These are the hatchling pythons. When you do find a hatchling python, you're going to want to go back and forth over that area to see if you can find some more. Generally, when a female python has a clutch, it can have anywhere from 30 to over 100 eggs. So you can find a bunch of snakes in one location if that clutch hatched out close to a road or a levee where you found a baby. So keep that in mind. I'm going to go ahead and show you some of the basic things that are going to be needed. So this is the basic stuff that you're going to want to have. Plenty of water. And this is the Everglades, and at night the mosquitoes can be terrible, so you're going to want to have some type of bug spray. These 2 have DEET, which is a pretty dangerous chemical. I generally do not like to use it, but I bring it for other people. I prefer to use either Skin So Soft or this bug spray right here, which is natural and has citronella in it. Works pretty well. This stuff is not quite as effective as the DEET, but at least it's not dangerous. Also, the Everglades is full of poison wood and poison ivy, so if you're going to be doing some bushwhacking, you're going to want to use Technu, so when you're done at the end of the evening, you'll be able to get that stuff off of you. Also, another thing you're going to want to have is some hand sanitizer if you want to keep yourself clean, if you get bit, or just generally want to wash your hands. Most essential items for at night are going to be a good headlamp. This one's actually only 25 bucks. I attach my headlamp to my hat so that when I have my hat on my head with the chin strap that's on the hat, I can go ahead and keep it attached to my head. If I have to wrestle with a big snake and I'm crashing through the bushes, this will stay on my head. I also carry a little handheld light. This one is 1200 lumens. It's very bright, and I can use it to pinpoint locate animals if I'm shining in the bushes. Also, in my case, I do use these custom-made LED lights that plug in via cigarette lighter to my vehicle. This is extremely bright and I can see well with it. Also, this is what a python's mouth looks like. This is a skull off of a 17-foot snake, and you'll see the size of those teeth. They can be quite formidable. It's nothing to worry about when you get bit by a python. It's not really a dangerous thing. The key to it is if you do get bit, you don't want to yank away, because you see how these teeth are curved back. If you yank your hand or part of your body out of a python's mouth, it's going to rip your flesh open. Even though it's counterintuitive, what you're going to want to do is let that snake bite and release on its own, which it will, as long as you're not restraining it. So those are some of the basic items that you're going to want to have. So I'm going to go ahead and go over some of the basic techniques now, and hopefully you win the challenge. We'll see how it goes. All right, so the first technique we're going to talk about is road cruising. And you want to get out there sometime right around sundown. So you see me heading out the Everglades right about at that time. And now we're just starting to switch over to the time that you'll actually start to see snakes, which will be right at dusk. Generally, pythons don't really start to move around in earnest until you get about 2 hours after dark. So during the Python Challenge, that's going to correlate with roughly 10:30. But there's sometimes a push of small snakes that are in the 6-7 foot range right at sundown. But you're going to want to get out there, and you're going to want to drive roads that are inside the program area. These can be dirt roads, they can be levees, they can be any of the areas that are accessible to the public. You're going to want to get out on these roads, and you're going to want to just cruise back and forth looking for snakes actually crossing the roads or coming out onto the roads. Pythons tend to move best between around 10:30 at night and 3:30 in the morning. You could catch them outside of these parameters, but that's the hot spot 5 hours. Also, unlike our native snakes, pythons will move equally on dirt roads or paved roads. With our native snakes, they kind of tend to move on dirt roads right at dark, and then once the sun goes down and the temperatures drop, they'll kind of linger a little bit more on the pavement. But for pythons, man, they're just moving around. So you can get out there on any of the roads that are paved or that are dirt that are inside the Python program zones, and you just kind of cruise back and forth. I like to drive at about 28 miles an hour so I can spot snakes that are coming out to the side of the road, but everybody has their own preference. Some people like to drive fast, but like I said, around 30 miles an hour is about right. You're going to encounter a lot of other people out there, and just find yourself a little bit of space. Be patient, be courteous. Don't blind people with your high beams and such, because as you see in these clips right here, there's a lot of other hunters out there. They're going to be patrolling these roadsides and so forth. But what you're going to come up on is this right here. You're going to see pythons that are actually crossing the road, and generally when you see one, they're going to be stretched out straight as an arrow. They're not going to have the S-curve in their body like most people would envision a snake. They're almost going to just look like a straight log. Oftentimes they won't be totally on the road, but you'll see, like in this case right here, just a little bit of the tail of a python that had already crossed the road, or in the case of this python coming up here in a second, you'll see a python that's just making its way onto the road. Either way, you're going to want to kind of keep your eyes scanning to the edges. The pythons will tend to look very bright if you get them broadside in the lights, because they're very reflective, and the chin will look very white. You can sometimes see it in the grass, but the snakes are very easy to spot when they are in the road. And if they're quartering away from you at an angle, instead of looking bright like you see right here, the snakes will tend to look dark, almost like a dark tube. But this snake right here gives a good example of what I'm talking about with lateral undulation, which is what they call like a caterpillar crawl. You see how this snake is crawling using its belly scales to pull it forward? That's why you see them moving in a straight line like this. So when you're looking for the snakes on the road, just look for a straight, long stick, just kind of like what you would see here. It's not exactly what people would envision. Oftentimes, when you're road cruising for pythons at night, the snakes get to the road and pull a U-turn. Like this snake here, the snakes have an aversion to being in open spaces, and even though it's at night, they can still see and detect that they're no longer in dense vegetation, and they don't like to be exposed. So a lot of times when they come out onto the edge of the road or outside of the thick vegetation, they'll kind of crawl out, and they might even come out 20-30 feet, but they'll pull a U-turn quite often and head back into the woods. But either way, if you get out there, and like I said, you're going to want to get out there pretty much right at the same time that you need your headlights, but they're not really doing you any good. That's kind of when it starts, and it'll start really picking up right around 10:30, and it'll remain good till you can catch them 4 and 5 in the morning, but generally around 3:30. And what you see here, this is going to be the bread and butter that's going to make up most of the python challenge. These are hatchling pythons. They can be incredibly abundant this time of year. If a clutch of eggs hatched out close to a roadside, it's possible to get dozens of pythons all just in one little stretch of road. So if you find a hatchling, you're going to want to go back and forth over that area and try to pick off as many as you can. But this is right here, this is an average size python for the summer months, and these snakes that are in this video, they range anywhere from about, I don't know, 6 feet up to about 9 foot, about like that snake there. But that's the bread and butter snake, like this one right here. This is a hatchling python, and this is the size you're going to find most often out there on the road. But don't think it's just on pavement. Sometimes you get big pythons like this one that are crossing some of these back roads that are out there in some of these areas. Either way, you want to be out there, like I said, and just kind of beating the bushes back and forth and drive, and hopefully you'll have some success. While road cruising is probably the easiest technique, especially for beginners who have never actually caught a python or snake hunted before, a little bit more advanced technique is to actually drive along the levees or the roadsides and shine where the mowed vegetation meets the tall vegetation. Kind of like if you're doing anything that involves animals like fishing, you always want to work an edge like a dock line or a weed line. Well, it's no different with the snakes. You see that the lights I have here are aimed right there at the side of the levee here, where the tall vegetation in the form of trees meets the low vegetation. The pythons will patrol right on this zone. They're moving along here. They're looking for rodents and wading birds and animals at night for them to prey. So they're actually foraging. So what you want to do is get out in these areas, and you don't have to have a vehicle. You can ride a bike and do this with the headlamps and handheld lights. You can even walk, although you will cover a lot less ground if you're walking, but you're going to want to shine these areas. And of course, anytime you can find water on the edges of these levees, it's even better. You can kind of think of pythons as a big gigantic water snake. They're highly aquatic, probably spending upwards of 85% of their time actually in the water. So the Everglades is full of water, so coincidentally it's phenomenal habitat for this invasive species. So you're going to want to get out there and, just like you see me doing here, shining right at that zone where the tall vegetation meets the short vegetation, and these pythons will patrol right along that edge. It's a really productive way to find snakes, and in fact, if you watch any of my other videos, you'll see that probably the vast majority of the time that I do hunt at night, I'm using this method where I'm shining that transitional zone. And it's like I said, it's the same for any kind of animal. You always want to hunt where there's a change, and the pythons certainly fall into that category of being easy to spot here, and also it's a zone that they utilize. And if you do not have a vehicle, or in a case of a lot of the Python program, the Python Challenge area, you're not allowed to bring a vehicle, but you're allowed to actually be there on foot, or you're allowed to be there on bike. So what you see me doing here is I actually got out and I'm walking down at the base of a levee. And it's even better because I can walk down in there, and you see all this water out there in this cypress swamp. I'm able to really see between the trees and between the ferns and down into that water itself. And oftentimes the pythons are actually laying in that water. Also, here's another section. This is a side of a levee that the public can't access, and you'll see me just kind of shining, on foot, doing the same exact thing I would be doing if I was in a vehicle or if I was on a bike. I'm shining that zone where that dense vegetation meets the low vegetation, and the pythons, as you're going to see in a minute, the pythons patrol right exactly along that edge. Sometimes a little few inches in, maybe even a few feet. But here's a perfect example of that. You see right here where the tall vegetation is in the background, and the python is stretched out right there where the low vegetation met the tall vegetation. This is the kind of thing that the python hunters look for. And here's another example of that right here. This snake was probably, 10 feet back in from the edge of the road, as is this one. And that's what you're looking for. You're just looking for that beautiful pattern. Also, on the roadsides where they mow the grass, it doesn't take much to conceal a snake. That's about a 7-foot python you see laying there, and it's laying in very low cut grass that's planted along the roadside edge, as is this snake right here. So you don't have to necessarily think you're trying to find something that's really hidden. Quite often these snakes are very easy to spot, and they're exposed pretty well. and you see like that guardrail right here, I'm actually right on the roadside. So it's not necessary to be way deep out in the middle of some Everglades levee to find snakes. You can be from out of town and really not know what you're doing, and just with a little bit of technique and some persistence, you can get out of there in the Everglades and you can find snakes right on these roadsides. A lot of times it's just like that right there. All you'll see is just the head, or maybe even just the tail, or as in the case of this snake, the whole snake is laying out. But like I said, it's something that you're going to want to stick with, and it's the same hours as if you're road cruising. It's going to be from dark till about 3:30 in the morning, with like 10:30 to 3:30 being prime time. And this next snake you're going to see here in a second, this is an example of what they real easy to spot. Look at that. That's just right there on a roadside edge where it meets the tall vegetation. And this one's actually doesn't even seem to be deterred by the car. It's actually crawling right towards the vehicle, which is pretty funny. These snakes, they don't get spooked that easily. But you get the idea. You're going to want to get out there and just work. If you want to try to win this, you're going to want to be out there all night, really. You can be out there from right at dark all the way till sunup, but it's really going to taper off after 3:30. But either way, this gives you a good representation of what you're looking for. You're looking for these snakes, even hatchlings like this one. You're looking for them right there on that transition zone between the dense vegetation and the short vegetation. And don't be deterred if you're trying to hunt areas and you can't get there with the vehicle because you don't have access. You can still get into a lot of these areas on foot, like I'm doing right here, or on a bicycle. And while you won't cover as much ground, you can certainly have a better chance of spotting the small details that someone would otherwise miss if they were in a vehicle. So a lot of these levees are really good, productive levees to hunt. You just won't be able to get out there in a vehicle. Don't let that be a deterrent. Just focus on the little tiny details that you can see when you're on foot, stuff like that, where you see just a little bit of a tail or a head or something of that nature sticking out. A lot of that's going to get missed by the people who are hunting from the vehicles. And a lot of these levees where you hunt on foot, like right here, you know, the snakes are still out right along the edges, just like they would be anywhere else, as you see my buddy Kyle here grabbing one. A couple of things to note are these snakes will actually sit around in ambush position, curled up in even very low vegetation, like this python here. You see this snake is just curled up, kind of just down in the grass. It's waiting for a rat or something to pass by. And one of the coolest ways that you can spot pythons at night is by when they're doing something called periscoping. And you see this snake, how it's sticking its head up. It's actually just come out of the thick vegetation and it's sticking its head up to get a better view of what's going on around it. Like this snake right here, you could spot the chin of that snake from 100 feet away if you're looking for the white of its belly as it's periscoping. So it's a great way to scan these edges on the side of the road and see the snakes sticking their heads up in the air. They don't all do it, but if a few of them do, it's a pretty cool way to find them. And of course, as I had mentioned earlier, they're a very aquatic animal. So if you can get into areas where you can ride a bike or you can get out there and walk, you can actually find these pythons patrolling along in the water, and oftentimes they're patrolling in the water right up against the dry ground. Why? Because that dry ground is the corridor that the rats and the raccoons and the wading birds, they walk along or sleep or sit upon at night. And these pythons, because they're buoyant, they can actually cover a lot of ground in the water, and they'll move right along these edges where their prey is either foraging or sleeping, and it's easy pickings for them. So if you're lucky enough to find yourself an area down there that's got some, flooded water from the rain or from canals or anything of that nature, it certainly is worth putting the time. And even for hatchlings like this right here, a lot of times they do lay in the water. It's one of my favorite ways to look for pythons, is actually to hunt in areas where they're actually laying in the swamp. It makes for they're pretty easy to spot against the background of the aquatic background of the algae and so forth. It gives like a yellow tinge to the water in the Everglades, and the snakes will show up real dark against that kind of background, so they're easy to spot. One of my favorite ways to find them, and a very productive way to find them indeed. So if you're lucky enough to come across some areas in the Everglades like that, and these areas change, it depends on how much rain we've had and stuff of that nature. So now that you've found a python, now you got to catch it. So I'm going to show you some basic techniques. I don't like to use tools because, like in the case of this python, a lot of times you need both hands. You might come across a very large snake that's in thick vegetation like this snake is, and you need all hands on deck to be able to pull that snake out of there. So I tend to not like to use things like hooks or
things of that nature for when I'm trying to, in fact, I never use these kind of tools. When I'm a python hunter, I use only my hands. It's not an ego thing, it's just a much more effective way of removing these animals from the wild. It's very difficult to have something in one hand and try to remove a python like this one right here out of thick vegetation single-handedly. In fact, it's almost impossible if the snake is over 10 feet. You're going to want to have both hands free. But when you do actually grab a python, you can grab it like this one right here. You can grab it by the tail, and what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to extract that snake out into the open like I've done here. And then the easiest way to catch a snake is to gently, and when I say gently, it doesn't take much pressure at all. You use your shoe as if you were using a hook. You just gently pin that snake down by the head without putting your body weight on it to injure it, just enough to keep the snake in place, and then you can reach down with your free hand, like I just did that right there, and inch your way up until you get the snake right up against the back of its jaws. So that way you keep yourself from getting bit. It's also a lot less stress on the animal than, a lot of people try to get these snakes to strike at them repeatedly and stuff to get views. I don't do that. I try to get the snake, I try to treat the snake with as much respect as possible. It's not their fault that they're an invasive species and that they're out there in the Everglades, so they do need to be removed, and when I do remove them, I try to make it as stress-free as possible for the animal and also less injury to myself. I don't need to get my hands torn up. They have pretty good sized teeth, as I had shown earlier. So what I do is hold them by the tail and just gently pin them down like I am doing right there with my foot, and just slowly with the other hand just inch your way up until you feel the jaws against your thumb and your fingers, just like that. But if possible, you can always do like I did just there, which is just what they call a head grab. If that head is exposed and the snake is not spooked, you can swoop in at the last second and boom, grab it just like that. One of the last things I want to mention is, if you're going to be out here during the Python Challenge, you're going to want to know how to identify our native snakes, because you see that snake that's laying right there on the edge where I told you to hunt? That's a Florida cottonmouth, which is a venomous species. Not only is it illegal to mess with that snake, but you certainly wouldn't want to mess with it and get yourself a bite that's probably going to result in the amputation of a finger or two. Here's another cottonmouth sitting on the edge here too. So they inhabit the same areas that the pythons do, and they're very, very common in the Everglades. You're going to see lots of cottonmouths if you're out there. And as you're scanning these roadside edges and you're driving these levees, cottonmouth is a very, very common snake. It's also known as a water moccasin, and you can see it does differ in coloration from the pythons, but if to an untrained eye, it's a big snake. It's got a pattern, and it could be mistaken for a python. Sometimes also, when you see a little bit of stuff down in the vegetation that you might think is a python, you might go all the way down in that grass because you saw something dark with your headlamp, only to get down there, look in the bushes, and find out you're actually looking at, in this case, two cottonmouths. This is a mating pair, a male and a female. So here's a close-up. The cottonmouth is highly, highly variable in coloration. Some are like this, which are kind of young, still have a vibrant pattern. Others are very, very dark. If you're lucky, you might bump into the eastern diamondback rattlesnake, which is another of the venomous species of snake that's found in South Florida. These are much, much harder to come by at night in the Everglades. But they are out there, and you will see them if you're out there shining the sides of the roads enough and the sides of the levees looking for pythons. You're going to see rattlesnakes. Like I said, you don't want to mess with this animal. This can be a fatal bite right here, not to mention it is protected in the state of Florida. So you want to, if you don't have permits for venomous snakes, so you want to definitely avoid them. And here you see a coral snake, which has a highly, highly toxic venom, but it's not a dangerous snake. If you just leave them alone and don't touch them, you won't have any problem with them. But you better know what they look like, because you might also come across this right here. This is a Florida scarlet snake. This is a non-venomous, harmless snake, and if you notice, looks a lot like a coral snake to the untrained eye. So you're definitely going to want to know your different species of snakes. And while you're out there during the Python Challenge, take the time to enjoy our native wildlife. You're going to see plenty of snakes and animals. This right here is a yellow rat snake, which is a very common species in the Florida Everglades. You'll see them almost every night. You might even get lucky and catch a glimpse of a Florida king snake. While they are dwindling in numbers over the years, I still see them in some of the areas that the Python Challenge occurs in. They can be quite abundant. This will probably be the most common snake you see. This is a banded water snake, or Florida water snake. These make up the bulk of the snakes that are found crossing the roads at night. Here's another beautiful, beautiful native snake. This is a corn snake, or a red rat snake. These are also quite abundant in certain areas, and they're totally harmless. You also might get lucky with this little guy right here. This is an eastern mud snake. Don't see these quite as often as we used to, but they're still out there. And of course, if you're shining these roadsides, you're gonna see alligators. Well, I leave you with one thought. While most of the snakes you're gonna find in the Everglades at night are gonna be a little bit on the small side, you might come up on a snake like this 17-footer here. So be prepared to have some fun and be prepared to have one heck of an adventure. Well, I hope this video helped you out. It was not intended to go over any of the laws or rules regarding the Florida Python Challenge. You would need to go onto the FWC, Florida Wildlife Commission website to find all the rules, regulations, and areas where you can actually participate in the challenge. This was just an overview of how to find snakes, and it was geared towards the beginner. I hope it was of help. If you enjoyed it, please like, a comment, and subscribe, and I hope to see you all out there in the field. Take care and stay safe.